everyone. I'm Suzanne Clemens, one of the pastors at Trinity United Methodist in Lafayette, Indiana, and it is great to be back this week sharing the message with you all. In our first scripture reading for today, we have the adventurous story of Jonah. And our lectionary text only gives us a snippet of this story, so I'm going to share an overview for those of us who might not be familiar. Or just it may have been a while since you've heard this story. Jonah is one of Israel's prophets, a person gifted and called by God to communicate between God and the people. So Jonah is a messenger, and God has told Jonah to go to the city of Nineveh, which is the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and give a message to the people there. Now, at its height, the city of Nineveh, which was located in the area that is now Iraq, well, at one time it was the most powerful city in the world. But as often happened in the cities of great empires, the people of Nineveh, well, they lost their way. They had turned away from God, and they were known among all of the nations for their extreme greed and oppression and their war and plundering against other nations. So Assyria's rulers they were just ruthless. They were known for torturing their captives, so just excessive in their violence and their brutality. And way before Jonah's time, Israel had been invaded and demolished by Assyria. And the Israelites at that time, many of them had been forced into exile in Assyria. And even though Israel, at the time of this reading, during Jonah's time, Israel has been restored and returned to stability, but the memory of Assyria's brutality has not dimmed. So, even at first glance, it's not a surprise that Jonah would have stonewalled about going to Nineveh, right? Because these are not people known for their warmth or their hospitality. And the likelihood that they're going to welcome Jonah's message, which God has told Jonah to tell the people there that in 40 days the city is going to be destroyed, well, Jonah just knows that they're not going to want to hear this. Well, so the first time that God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh, well, Jonah hightails it in the opposite direction, and he flees about over 2,000 miles away to a city in what would now be Spain. Well, in his escape from God's leading, he has to cross the Mediterranean, so he hops on a boat and hunkers down, hoping that God's going to forget and leave him alone. Because for him, going to Nineveh, well, it's just unthinkable. But God does not forget, and nor does God release Jonah from the purpose that God has for him. So God ends up sending a storm on the sea to disrupt Jonah's escape. And with the boat threatening to capsize, the sailors throw Jonah overboard at Jonah's urging in an attempt to appease God. And at this time, the storm clears. Jonah ends up, cast into the sea. Well, God sends a fish, a great fish. And this big fish, probably a whale, swallows Jonah. And Jonah spends 3 days in the dark belly of the fish in the underworld of the ocean. And after 3 days, the fish expels Jonah on dry land. And now Jonah has a second chance to respond to God's call, right? Go to Nineveh and give the people my message. Well, this time, still reluctant, but Jonah does relent and goes to Nineveh. And he delivers what is identified as the shortest sermon in all of Scripture. He says to the people, in 40 more days, Nineveh will be overthrown. Well, the impossible thing happens. The people actually listen. They have a change of heart. And in an almost comedic turn of events, the people fast and put on sackcloth and ashes to show sorrow for their ways. The king even orders that the animals of the country put on sackcloth, right? So you see the comedic aspects of this story, right? Well, at the end of the day, the people of Nineveh change, and God sees them and forgives them, and the destruction that had been forewarned doesn't happen. Well, you might think that given Jonah's amazing success as a prophet here, that he would be happy. If you think about it, he's really the only hugely successful prophet in all of the Bible. But he's not happy. In fact, he is downright angry that God has chosen to spare Nineveh. And at this point in the text, he confesses why he fled from God's call in the first place. He says that he knew that God had a heart for mercy, and he was afraid that God was going to have compassion on Nineveh. So he ran from God because he couldn't stand to witness God giving Nineveh a chance to change. And in anger, he actually rails at God, right? He yells out, "I knew you would change your mind and have compassion on those horrible people." Well, Jonah goes on to grumble and then to suffer because he just can't get over the fact that God has been good to these awful people, that God apparently loves them. Jonah is stuck because he has this fixed mindset about who's deserving, about who's good, and he thinks that he can judge which people deserve certain outcomes in the world, right? And if we're honest, I think we could acknowledge too, right, that this is part of the human condition, isn't it? Right? That we look around and we judge, right? I mean, at the very least, I will share that, yes, I have a tendency myself. In particular, I have a tendency to judge the character of a person that I've not even met yet just by the way he or she behaves behind the wheel of a car. I do. I also notice that I have the same tendency toward judgment when I encounter people who are rude toward frontline workers, in stores or shops, businesses, doctor's office. It really gets to me. And I've noticed that any time that I feel irritation starting to rise in me toward a person or a group of people who are not acting the way that I want to see them act or that I would act in a situation, and I also find myself thinking something like, who in the world do they think they are? Well, that for me is a good sign that I'm probably stepping into judgmentalism and some condescension. And in those times, probably I would want to say that I'm pretty sure that God might agree with me about those assessments, right? We tend to think that God would have the same assessment that we do about others. So we're all at risk, aren't we, if we're not very careful of sorting humanity into categories of deserving or undeserving. We're quick to judge. And certainly these people get on God's nerves too, right? And certainly God would want to show them their shortcomings and the error of their ways. Well, Ron Rolheiser tells a joke that I want to share. And this is a joke that he tells about a Catholic priest who had lived a long and faithful life as an obedient servant of God, serving the church, being obedient in his vows of poverty and service and chastity. And when the priest finally dies and enters the pearly gates, well, lo and behold, who does he encounter in heaven but Hugh Hefner, right? And he's shocked. He's like, "Hugh Hefner, how in the world did you get in here?" Right? It does not seem fair. And Rolheiser says, okay, so let's contrast that response with how we might imagine that Mother Teresa might have greeted Hugh Hefner in heaven. Mother Teresa might have said, "Oh, thank goodness you made it," right? I was concerned about you, right? I was afraid you might not make it in. I'm so glad you made it into heaven. Two different kinds of responses, aren't they? Well, as Jonah approached Nineveh, we see that his heart was hardened and that his mind was so fixed on what he thought was right and fair, that he's developed a kind of emotional superiority that supersedes God's mercy. And in this satirical and unexpected plot twist, the prophet of God's people quarrels with God and resists God's compassion, and it's the corrupt Assyrians who actually open their hearts to God, change their ways, and escape destruction. So, one of the morals of this story is that we cannot predict or pigeonhole anyone in the grand story of how God's grace moves in our world. We can't trust ourselves to predict who the good or the bad players are going to be in the long view of things. And in my reading, it's really a solid lesson in humility and faith in God's way, which means that there is no place or no person, no people, no situation that cannot be redeemed by God, and that God waits and desires nothing more than to give second chances and to shower all of those who turn to Him with grace and mercy. Well, our gospel reading today from the book of Mark stands in contrast to Jonah's story, but there's also a core thread between these two readings. So here in Mark, we see another story of God calling. We see Jesus walking along the seashore, approaching the first ones who will become his followers and companions. So Jesus is walking along, and he's telling them, now's the time. He says, the time's finally here. Change your life, change your ways. Come with me, and I will show you the way. And there was something so compelling about Jesus, right? There was some way that Jesus spoke to their deepest need and their deepest yearnings. And these fishermen, well, they were ready. Must have been tired of the way that things were, and they were ready for a lasting intervention in their lives and in their world. They were ready for a change, and they were ready to change. Well, what is it really for any of us that brings us to the point of changing? It could be many things. Maybe it's I'm tired of the way that things have been. I'm tired of being stuck. Maybe I'm tired of being angry or feeling hopeless. Maybe I'm tired of hanging on to resentment or tired of being afraid. Maybe one's tired of how wearing and isolating it can be to be judgmental. Or maybe you're tired of not giving yourself over to what's really important, to what you know is life-giving. What does it ultimately take for any of us to walk away from those things, on the one hand, that keep us stuck, and then to change direction, right? And trust in a different way, in God's way of mercy and hope and true freedom. Well, just as God called Jonah and the Assyrians, and as Jesus called the fishermen by the sea, the divine calls to each one of us today. And the call is, are you ready for a change? Would you like a second chance, a fresh start? Are you ready to go somewhere new? God is constantly calling each of us. And I know that when we talk about God's call to us in the church, we're more familiar with thinking about calling as the place that God's leading us to serve in the world. We tend to associate call with our vocation or the work we do. And that's certainly one of the ways God calls us. And it's important, we're to pay attention to how God's created us, the special way that God's made each of us with unique abilities and histories, as well as the desires and yearning that God places on us, in order to find that place where, as Frederick Buechner has described it, the place where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And when we live from that place, whether it's as an educator or a bus driver, veterinarian, caregiver, or artist, whatever that calling is, well, when we live through that place that we're called to be, we change the world. And yet, God is also calling each of us in an even deeper way. He's calling us in every new and maturing season of our lives to deeper compassion and to deeper mercy. And when we're open to change and to listening for the Spirit's guidance as our life changes, God will do the slow work of shaping our hearts to be more like His. And all God asks for is our cooperation, right? Even a small yes is enough for God to use us to make the world a more compassionate place. And I'm sure you all probably feel like I do, which is that our world needs the example of compassion and mercy that we have to share. To spend any time following the events of our world these days, it feels like it's to risk being alarmed by this increasing tenor of intolerance and hostility and suffering in our country and all over the world that we see. Globally, there's the violence in the Ukraine and Gaza that's caused a devastating loss of life. Here in the U.S., we see the hostility between different factions, especially around issues of gun violence and gun rights. There's also issues of race and gender, and these divisions and factions just keep growing. We're becoming a nation uglier by the day in the way that we treat each other and our lack of respect for each other's basic humanity and dignity. There seems to be no room in the public square for respectful and collaborative relationships across any lines of political affiliation. Instead, there's mostly vindictive mudslinging everywhere you look. The rich grow richer, the poor grow poorer, and the past few years parallel with these things, which, I guess is not surprising. We see these skyrocketing rates of mental health crises and substance use disorder. As a country, we're more angry and fearful and insecure than we've ever been in my lifetime. So what will it take for us to change individually and collectively? One thing I do know is that God is always summoning us to change. He's calling us to create a world built on compassion and mercy, not fear and anger and hostility. God means to give us hearts and wills for living together peacefully. And I think the only way that we can start is by examining the quality of our hearts. We have to start with us. So are there moments or situations when we detect ourselves growing hard or defensive with others? Because if there's any hardness within us, you can be sure that others notice. And it will prevent us from being able to listen and establish any kind of real connection and rapport and empathy. Now, as the saying goes, people don't care what you say or what you know until they know that you truly care. And when you truly care and want the best for someone else, especially someone who can't do anything for you or someone who has wronged or offended you, this has the power to change the energy in a relationship or situation in a very deep way. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to lead a new restorative justice ministry in my previous congregation. And it was an eye-opening, deeply meaningful experience. After doing a couple of years of inner work on racial justice, a group of us decided to reach out in Greater Lafayette and see if there was a way that we could serve others in our community who needed support and healing from being part of the criminal justice system. And to put a long story short, our local adult probation department was eager to partner with us, and our congregation began forming circles of support and accountability for individuals who were on probation. So a small circle of 3 or 4 of us would partner and meet with someone on probation. And we would get together with them about once a week for a year, offering friendship, support, compassionate listening, and guidance, and basically just committing to be a steady, caring presence for them. And I had the privilege of companioning a young woman in her 30s who taught me so much about courage and spunk and perseverance. And I'll call her Lacey. Well, our circle of friends who met with Lacey, we wanted her to know that her past did not define her. We wanted her to know that there was a hopeful way forward in her life that could lead to stability and forgiveness and healing from so many hurtful things that were in her past. And that's why we showed up every week, month after month, for about a year. And our trainer who equipped us for this work told us that the commitment to a year of this work was of vital importance. Because as he explained, for most of the people that we companioned, it was going to take at least 6 months for them to even believe that we were serious about what we were doing and to quit suspecting that we would bail on them at any time. And he was right. It took about 6 months for us to build a strong, basic trust. And this was such a sacred and powerful experience to be a companion for Lacey. And as I reflect on it, I realize that we were all being a messenger of sorts. God had called us to share a message with Lacey, a message that she was worth our full and undivided attention, that she was created good in the image of her loving Creator, that Lacey was deserving of our commitment and care without needing to return anything tangible to us. And our openness to her, our willingness to be patient and not abandon her in her relapses, in her struggles, in her failures, well, it showed her what it meant to be loved without condition, to be deserving of love, and having yet another chance to change. And God is calling you on this journey too, to place your trust and your identity in God's hands so that your heart can become ever wider, growing in compassion, so that you can extend mercy to others, even others who might be really hard to love. And it can take a long time, but it's God's work in you, and it will happen. And that is good news for all of us, isn't it? I believe it is. Thanks be to God.